Welcome back to Music Appreciation. Today's lesson is 3.2, Electronics and Synthesis. Let's take a look at the day. We'll begin today's lesson by talking about musique concrète versus synthesis, the two major types of electronic music. And then we'll talk about synthesis, how that works, and then we'll talk about synthesizer controls, and then we'll finish out with MIDI. So for next time, you're going to read my effects reading, and I tried to simplify the large topic of effects so we can just focus on the most common ones. What we just heard there is the soundtrack to the movie Forbidden Planet from 1956. The music was written by Bibi and Louis Barron, who were early electronic film pioneers, or electronic music pioneers. They started their work in about 1948, and you can think of about 1950 or thereabouts as being the real starting point for electronic music blossoming. So this was the first fully electronic soundtrack to a film, and it also shows a lot of the early synthesis techniques and musique concrète techniques that were used from there on. Before that, one of the very first electronic instruments was the telharmonium, which was invented by Thaddeus Cahill in 1897, and it was a organ that transmitted electrical signal from one room across a building into another room. And it was used in rich people's parties to entertain them with this new idea of electronic music. From the 50s on, we know that synthesizers and all types of electronic music really blossomed. We had the work of Moog, M-O-O-G, and he lived in Asheville, around here, for quite a long time. We know we have the Moog factory in town. So the synthesizers first were, like computers, a room full of equipment that was needed to make one single sound. But as time went on, they became portable, especially in the late 60s and early 70s. You start to hear them throughout pop music and in experimental classical music, etc. About the 1980s, we get the invention of MIDI, M-I-D-I, Musical Instrument Digital Interface, which is a way for computers and devices to talk to each other and record musical performances. So we'll come back to that in a minute. So electronic music was split between two basic camps starting in the 1950s, musique concrète and synthesis. So these are two different approaches to how to make music with electronics. Musique concrète, meaning concrete music in French, was an approach that uses microphones and recordings to assemble together sounds and create music. So you can go out and record the stream or record a bird and mix together the sounds, stretch them out, change the pitch, put them all together and create music, and that's called musique concrète. So the concrete part of it is the recordings of real life sounds. As we know, the sounds of nature are complex, that we've seen in the spectrum, and there's a lot of variety there to work with, but also possibly a little bit less control. Synthesis is very different, on the other hand. Synthesis is synthesizing or creating sounds from scratch. So creating sounds from nothing using oscillators to create new waveforms. So a sine wave, square wave, triangle wave, and sawtooth wave, the basic waveforms, could be created with an oscillator. So we start creating new sound from scratch, and that's synthesis. Obviously, these two things can be mixed together and were all along, but still there's a good distinction to be made between musique concrète, recordings, and synthesis of new sounds. So we just heard 3 examples of musique concrète. So musique concrète came about in France in the electronic music studios in the early 1950s. The first example you heard is one of those early examples by Pierre Schaeffer, and it's one of the first examples of electronic music in musique concrète style, just using recordings of the world. The second example was Lipo Studio and So On by Matmos, who are an electronic music band. They sampled surgical sounds to create this beat. And the last example there was The Books, Enjoy Your Worries, You May Never Have Them Again, which you can hear blends acoustic instruments and musique concrète samples of a lot of different things. Brian Eno, who's a composer and worked with a lot of famous recording artists, including David Bowie and Talking Heads. Brian Eno wrote this great article called The Studio as Compositional Tool. You can hear his music on our listening list, the Music for Airports, which is an early electronic piece. But he talks a little bit about musique concrète and why it's so appealing to many composers and musicians. So here's some of the points from his article. If you want to read the whole article, you can look up The Studio as a Compositional Tool. So he talks about how recording makes repeatable what is otherwise transient. So some little moment in the studio when you drop a coin onto the piano is transient or just momentary in real life. But if it's recorded, you can repeat it over and over again, and you can stretch it out in time and capture these little moments and play with them. Composers can supply material too subtle for a first listening, so you can work with stuff that you might not catch right away the first time you hear it, but as you continue to work with the sound, you might be able to zoom further in on that sound. He says that an arbitrary collision of events seems meaningful after many listens, which is just sort of fun, kind of saying that sounds colliding in a particular way after you listen a lot of times can have more meaning. There's this famous story of the composer Henry Cowell. He used to compose in this barn, and someone stopped by his barn and comes in, and he's banging out this incredibly dissonant sounding chord, this strident and strange sounding chord, and the person says, "What are you doing, Henry?" And Cowell says, "I'm playing this chord until I like it." So I think that kind of relates to what Eno is saying here, in that, by hearing sounds over and over again, they can gain some other type of meaning that they didn't have the first time around. He says detachable media allows us to hear recordings outside of their original locale. So that was true in all the examples we just heard, where surgical sounds or recordings of children playing allows us to incorporate them in a different context. So tape, just meaning recording in general, was a malleable medium, unlike discs and cylinders. So he's saying that he's talking about the early days where tape was literally cut. So discs and wax cylinders, which came before, couldn't really be changed once they were recorded. But tape, you could play it slower, you could play it backwards, you could cut it up and put it back together again. And that's still true, of course, with digital recording. Additive approach to composition: instead of starting with a set ensemble like a rock band, a composer could begin with just a few tracks or just one and add to them. So that's a different way of composing than by writing for an orchestra. You can just hear one sound, let's say a bird singing, and listen to it over and over again and decide what instruments to put with it, so you can assemble additively. He says the in-studio composition begins without a conception of a piece. Instead, starts with small or starts with nothing at all and experiments with adding and subtracting tracks. So like a painter working directly with paint and having the ability to cut and add directly. So he sees the studio or using recordings as working directly with sound, getting immediate feedback. So when you turn the sound around, when you do something with the sound, you get to hear the results right away. That's as compared to traditional composition of music, which involves writing notes on paper and then months later hearing performers play them and then deciding whether to change it. So obviously recording has an immediate feedback to the composer. And finally, that recording allows for the absolute control of relative volume. And he brings up in the article the celery, that there's a very loud celery biting in an early song by the Beach Boys. I think it's called Vegetables. And you just hear this celery incredibly loud. And so, unlike in real life or in a room, we can have the celery be the loudest thing on the recording and a drum set be incredibly quiet. So these are some reasons why Eno and others are attracted to musique concrète, or partially musique concrète music. So now we move on to the other side of electronic music, which is synthesis. So again, synthesis is creating sounds from scratch using an electronic oscillator. So the oscillator is the most basic part of a synthesizer. It oscillates a signal back and forth between 1 and -1, just like we've seen on the waveform. So we're going to start by looking at a few examples here, and I'll show you some of the basics of synthesis. In addition to the Stolet reading that you've been looking at, if you want another resource, I like Bo Sievers, bosievers.com/synth basics. This is a nice, clear organization to thinking about basic synthesis. So remember, in synthesis, we're creating the sound from scratch. So we already know that sounds oscillate back and forth between 1 and -1. So if we have any recording of a sound, we will see it go back and forth. But with an oscillator, we're telling it to synthesize a new sound that oscillates back and forth at a certain speed. So we want to give the oscillator a frequency, let's say 440 hertz, and then we might also give it a volume. So does it go all the way to 1 and -1, or does it just go to 0.5 and -0.5? That's basic synthesis. It's telling an oscillator how fast to oscillate, so the frequency, the volume, and then the final element is the waveform. We've talked a little bit about the sine wave so far, and we're going to talk more about all 4 of the basic wave shapes today. So to look again at the spectrum and waveforms here, we will see now all four of the basic waveforms. So let's start at looking just at their waveforms and zooming in. First we have the sine wave. You can see it's a perfect sine wave here. Let's go ahead and hear that. And we notice again that it only has one partial. Now let's hear the triangle wave. So you can see the triangle wave here, and looking at its harmonics, we notice that we have more harmonics than the sine wave, but less than the other ones. So we see some odd harmonics, harmonics 1, 3, and 5. So it's closer to the sine wave than the other two, the square wave and the sawtooth wave, but it still has some other harmonics, unlike the sine wave. And we can see that just kind of geometrically as well. The sine wave is perfectly pure and round, whereas the triangle wave, of course, is more jagged, but it still moves gradually back and forth over the line. So you can think about it as sort of a more blunt sine wave. It still follows the same shape, but now it's linear in path. Let's hear the square wave, which is also known as the pulse wave. It looks like this. So there we see that it has also odd harmonics like the triangle wave, but they go up much higher. So there's more harmonics there. And like I was saying with the triangle wave, the pulse wave or square wave also follows a kind of blunt path of the sine wave. It still goes back and forth in the same way, but now it just jumps up to, let's say, 1, jumps down to -1. So it's like how very low bit computer signal would work. So if you think about very early video games, they would have like an 8-bit, or even before that, like a 4-bit audio track. So you'd hear sounds that sounded like this because you only need a very small amount of information to reproduce this, just dots up and down, up, down, up, down. Whereas with the sine wave, in order to recreate that, you need dots all along to make the fluid path. So this is the square wave or pulse wave. And then finally, the sawtooth wave. So you can see the sawtooth wave jumps up like the pulse wave did, but then it ramps down like the triangle wave did. So it looks like a sawtooth, that's why it's called that. And it can be inverted the other way around, where it ramps up and then jumps down. They sound relatively similar. And we can see that the spectrum for this one has all the harmonics. So it makes a very buzzy and bright sound. It has 1, 2, 3, 4. So it has even and odd harmonics. So synthesis uses these basic shapes. When you look at an analog synthesizer or any kind of synthesizer, you'll see an option on your oscillator to set it to these different waveforms. You can blend between them by having multiple oscillators and combining them. That's very common as well. But I want you to remember these basic waveforms: sine wave, triangle wave, square wave, aka pulse wave, and sawtooth wave. And I want you to know what their basic harmonic scheme is like, what their spectra look like. So sawtooth, all the harmonics; sine wave, only one partial; and the triangle, odd harmonics, quieter and less high; and the square wave, Now let's move on to talking about. So we're going to be looking at this soft synth, this software synthesizer. It's called Element, and you can see it's designed to look like an old analog modular synthesizer. So it's set up in the same way that old synthesizers would have been set up. First thing we're going to do is look at the oscillators and try out some stuff with that. So, to try out some oscillators, this is what you would see on a synth. So we see our four types of wave shapes right here: sine wave, sawtooth wave, triangle wave, and pulse wave or square wave. And over here we see some feet. This is 2 feet, 4 feet, 8 feet, 16 feet. This is an octave. So this is based on the old organ pipes. So when you played a large pipe organ, if you played through the 2-foot pipes, you'd be playing a higher octave. If you played through the giant 32-foot pipes, you'd be playing a lower octave. So this just comes from organ labels, and you can hear that now. I can change the octave. For the moment, we're just going to look at oscillator 1. Oscillator 2 works basically the same way. But just looking at oscillator 1, let's hear our different wave shapes, and this gives us a little readout of what's happening. So we can change the tuning or the fine tuning if we want. And we can select our octave. And now let's go ahead and add in a second oscillator. So synthesizers often work by having 2 oscillators and combining the sounds of the 2. The way this one works is with this little slider. So it mixes all the way left is only oscillator 1, all the way right is only oscillator 2. In between is a mix of both. So we might want, for example, a very smooth sound with the sine wave in a medium octave. And on oscillator 2, we might want a sharper or a more rich and buzzy sawtooth wave. But maybe we want that one in a higher octave. Let's hear them both together. So now I'm only pressing one key on the keyboard, but we hear the octave difference and the timbral difference of the 2 wave shapes. So I can try some different things here. At the moment, I like hearing this square wave, but I want to balance it a little bit more toward the sine wave like this. So we just hear a little bit of the square wave. So that's how you work with oscillators in a synthesizer. This is the same thing that you would do with a hardware synthesizer that you're looking at in real life. The software synthesizers work the same way. So you can have a really bassy sound if you want. Or a really kind of smooth and high sound. So one of the ways that synthesizers were designed is to try to get them closer and closer to the shape of real instruments, to the sounds of real instruments. So we've talked about how the different waveforms give different timbres. Those may or may not sound like different instruments. We talked a little bit in the last lesson about how the pulse wave, because it has mostly odd partials, or only odd partials, sounds a little bit like a clarinet. Whereas the sine wave maybe sounds a little bit more like a voice. But one of the other things that real instruments do is they have a specific shape to their volume in time. That's called an envelope. So if we look back at the Bo Sievers article here, we can talk a little bit about envelope generators. Envelope generators, or ADSRs, are a way of controlling the volume in time. So this is another thing I want you to learn about synth. This is time and volume. So what we can do is to work on our the shape or the envelope of our sound to have a different volume shape in time. The way that ADSR works is you control how long it takes for the attack. So it's how fast the sound rises to its full volume. The decay, how long the sound takes to go down to its sustaining volume. And then the sustain is measured in how loud the sustaining volume is. And then the release, when you let go of the key on the keyboard, how long it takes for the sound to disappear. So when you have what we've been doing is just called organ mode, where when I press the key, it's on full volume right away. The second I release the key, it's off. That would be like having an attack that's instant, a decay that's instant, and a full volume sustain, and then a release that's instant. But the shape of an acoustic instrument would take a second for the attack to go up to its full volume, or it would take part of a second. Then it would decay for a second down to the sustaining volume, and when I release the key, it would take a second for that to happen. So the ADSR, attack, decay, sustain, and release, are an envelope to the volume. That's controlled on the synthesizer in a VCA. So in order to make an ADSR on this synthesizer, we go to the section labeled VCA. That stands for Voltage Controlled Amplifier. That just means this is the overall amplifier for our sound. So right now it's in organ mode, like I said, so it has an instantaneous attack, so a very, very short time to attack, instantaneous decay and release, so all of these happen instantly, and the sustain volume is all the way up. Let's turn the sustaining volume down. So the sustaining volume is, for as long as I'm holding the key, that's the volume in percentage that we'll have. Let's try if I move the attack up a little bit. That means it's going to take longer. These are milliseconds. So if I go to 100 milliseconds or even higher, let's say 200 milliseconds. So it's going to take 1/5 of a second for the sound to ramp up to the volume of the sustain. So if I go even longer, it's going to fade in slowly like a string pad. So with a long attack, we have a slow ramp up to the volume. The decay, as you remember, is how long it takes to come down to the sustaining volume. So if we have a longer decay, let's move that up. Let's move the attack down a little bit. So it's going to take a while for the sound to ramp up to its volume and a while for it to ramp back down to the sustaining volume. I'm going to change to a triangle wave here. And the release is when I release the key. So the second I take my finger off of the key on the keyboard, right now it's instantly releasing the sound, but we want to be more like a acoustic instrument for it to take a second for the sound to go away, because only an organ or an electronic instrument could drop off immediately. If you plucked a string or played a harp or an oboe, it would take a second for the sound to stop. So that's the release. If I have a very high release, Let's move the attack and decay down a little bit. You hear it fade out after I release my finger. So that's the ADSR. And you can play around with these and try to emulate some acoustic instruments. For example, I could try to make a plucking sound, like a pizzicato cello or like plucking a guitar. That would have a relatively fast attack, and it would have a relatively fast decay, and it would have a longer release. So when I pluck a string, it plucks, the sound comes on pretty fast, maybe 10 milliseconds. It drops down, maybe a little bit slower, and then when I release, it has a long release because I take my finger off that plucked string, but it keeps ringing out for a long time. This is what that would sound like. It's a little bit more like a harp. And again, if we do the opposite with a long attack and a pretty short release, we would have something more like a string swelling in and then cutting off. So, ADSR, an envelope. In the next lesson, we're going to get into filtering a little bit, but the last thing for introducing basic synth elements is to talk about LFOs. So an LFO is a low frequency oscillator. So it's an oscillator just like these that's going to be combined with these oscillators to create some variation to the sound. So by low frequency, what it means is extremely low or sub-audio, infrasonic. When we think about our sine waves up here, if I play let me turn it off. We can think about this triangle wave is going, let's say, at 200 times per second, 200 hertz. Whereas the low frequency oscillator means something more like, let's say, 1 hertz. So it's below the range of our hearing as pitch. That means this low frequency oscillator is going to oscillate once every second. And so what we do with that is combine it with our main oscillators to vary, for example, the volume. So down here, I have the LFO set to the VCA, meaning it's going to modulate the volume. And modulation is a change in time. So if I turn this up, I'm going to be modulating the overall volume, and here's what's happening. A new oscillator in any of the shapes is going to oscillate as an LFO to modulate our main oscillators at 1 hertz. You can hear this happening. If I change the waveform of the LFO, you'll hear this waveform applied to the overall volume. Now we hear that sawtooth wave changing the overall volume. If I turn the rate of the LFO up, we hear more like vibrato. So again, it's a low frequency oscillator, so this is only 4 hertz. You can see the rate of the oscillator here. So you can use that to create rhythm if you want. And if you want a harder attack on the LFO, you can change the waveform. So I just want you to know that an LFO is a low frequency oscillator. It modulates the overall sound by a slow frequency. And that can be used to create vibrato, of volume, or you can also use it to oscillate the pitch. So here's an example where the same thing is happening, but it's changing the pitch. So with these basic elements of oscillators, ADSR envelope, and an LFO, you can create a basic synthesis patch. Our last topic for today is MIDI, M-I-D-I, Musical Instrument Digital Interface. So what we're going to do is use MIDI information to play this synth. So we're going to leave the synth where we had it. Here's what it sounded like. Just a simple synthesizer. I took off the LFO just for simplicity. What we're going to do is use information. So, to use MIDI, what we're going to do is use a keyboard, a MIDI keyboard, that is one type of MIDI controller. So it's connected with a MIDI cable. It's a 9-pin cable, but you can also use a MIDI keyboard that's really cheap that goes into your computer with USB, and you can control MIDI with that. So the important thing to know about MIDI is that unlike audio, MIDI is just control information. It's not sound, it's just a recording of a performance. So if we think about the synthesizer that we're using here, that hopefully you can still hear. That synthesizer is just the instrument, and what we need is a way to control it and play it. So you can just click notes into your computer and create MIDI that way, but it's much more musical to use a MIDI controller or a MIDI keyboard to do that. So what MIDI is a recording of my performance. So it's not a recording of the sound coming out of this keyboard, but it's a recording of what I did. So if we start recording, and I start playing, let's go ahead and have a click track on. As I'm playing along, as I'm playing with that click track, what's being recorded in terms of MIDI data is what key I pressed and when I pressed it in time in relation to that tempo. So the MIDI recording says B flat, this B flat, and it's pressed at this beat of the measure, measure 3. And it also records how loud the note is, how loud I played it. And that's what's called MIDI velocity. And the reason it's called velocity and not volume is because, technically speaking, what it's measuring is how fast this key goes down. When you hit a key hard, what literally happens is the key goes down very fast. When you hit the key softly, it goes down at a slower speed. So MIDI velocity makes the volume. So MIDI messages are note, timing, and velocity or volume. And so that's how we can play this keyboard in time, and it records the MIDI data. Let's take a look at what the MIDI data looks like. So this is what the MIDI data looks like that I performed. It shows up as these little blocks of information in time. So we see what's called a piano roll. It's a record of what I played. So if I play this back now, we'll hear what I just played on the keyboard. So you see these little blocks show up in time. Up here are the measures, and the colors relate to how loud I played them, or the velocity. So the darker colors, the red colors, are higher velocity, so louder, and the green and blue are lower velocity or volume. So this is what MIDI data is. It's a recording of a performance, and we can zoom in here and see these exactly. So you can record some MIDI data, use your instrument, and then you could change things. This is one of the beauties of MIDI. I can play this back now again and change the actual sound. So instead of being locked into the audio sound, I can change the sound while we're hearing the MIDI playback. So I can change the settings of our synth and still have the same performance of when I hit the keys and how hard I hit the keys. The other thing is we can edit and adjust what we did with the MIDI. So here you can see that I played a little bit out of time. I can drag these and place them in time exactly on these lines. I can cut them a little shorter. That buzzy sawtooth wave is a little much. Let me turn that off. So I can change these, the lengths of these. I can add notes just by clicking in new notes or moving around the notes that we have. If I played a wrong note, I can fix it. Maybe I want at the end of this to go down to this note at the very end. So I can adjust my MIDI performance using these MIDI blocks, and I can move them all exactly in time by quantizing them. So I can just move them exactly to the right place. Quantizing just means shifting everything exactly in time. Let's hear it now. So that's how MIDI basically works. It's a recording of a performance that records what note I played, when I played it in time, and how loud in terms of velocity I hit the keys. Now you could do all kinds of things and add and change your loop. You could, for example, loop this information over and over again like this. I could just copy and paste it. And I could play it back and change my synth settings some more. Okay, so that's just an overview of MIDI. I want you to know what MIDI is and how it's different than audio information. These are not themselves sounds. They are just MIDI events, they're called. So they're just when notes were played. So I could change the instrument entirely and still play these notes through it. I could add another instrument that's playing along in time with the same music. So that's MIDI. And that wraps up lesson 3.2, where we've gotten into musique concrète, synthesis, synthesizer modules and controls, and MIDI information. Next time we'll be moving on to talk about audio effects like distortion and compression, and that will finish up our timbre module. See you next time.